What's up, everyone? It's Adar coming at you with another episode of Startup Engineering Daily. Let's hop right into it. So our first tweet is from Lawrence Allen, who is the Terra Nova CEO, which is, I guess, a hardware company that basically builds machines that help like remove flooding and a bunch of other things, but it's like very physical, hardware based. So he has a lot of experience in what we're talking about. So he's replying to a tweet from Brett Adcock, who's the CEO of Figure, which is the robotics company that does the demos of like washing dishes and all those things. And Brett is announcing this new company called Hark, which is a new artificial intelligence lab building the most advanced personal intelligence in the world. I just thought it was interesting because it was something we've been talking about before, which is that Lawrence says he feels very strongly there's a nobility in doing one thing well that is forsaken when you try to do many. I cannot understand how employees of these companies can be expected to be loyal to a mission when their founder isn't. And then he goes on to talk about like how Elon is a kind of separate situation because he exited to PayPal and then PayPal exited as well, and then he had Tesla, and then he had SpaceX because he felt that those were two very specific initiatives that he had to work on. But I just think it's interesting. The more I think about it personally, I am definitely on the side of like you should just do one thing well, and like building a startup is already like over time more than one person can handle. So working on more than one startup doesn't really make sense unless you truly have a team that's outsourcing, and then you're not really running it. You know, it's like the team that you build under you is running it. But if you're in the beginning of your career and you don't have the capital to make those things happen, you're really like handicapping yourself by working on more than one thing at once. And then how do you like cope with the shiny object syndrome and stuff like that too? So my kind of philosophy right now is that if you're the type of personality where you're not worried about letting people down, then basically whenever a new opportunity comes that you really feel is better than the ones that you're working on, you should just quit one opportunity to take on a new one, right? So if you're working on something and you're really excited about it, but then you find something that you think is actually a better opportunity and you see more outcome, and you always have to work from first principles of like what your end goals are, but you see something that will help fit that goals better, you should quit the one that you're working on and accept the new one. But for me personally, I'm very bad at letting people down, and like, you know, I don't think there's a moral judgment on either side. Maybe even a moral judgment on like not letting people down is possibly even worse because you're kind of like hurting yourself for other people, which is never the right way to think about things. But basically, I think the dichotomy is like you either have to be someone who's willing to quit things immediately when you're taking on a new project, or for me personally, what I've done is I just banned myself from new commitments for now. Like my commitments that I have are very solid, and it's essentially 3 to 4 big commitments, which is already like way too much, you know. But one of them is like very heavily reduced. But I think you either have to ban yourself from commitments or be willing to quit. And it's very interesting, you know, there's a lot of cool projects. Obviously on Twitter, you're going to see things that are going to make you want to work on something else, or you're going to be like, oh, this is a great idea, or this person's making more money than me, I have to do what they're doing. Most of that is social media driven, you know, where it's kind of LARPing. So I don't think Twitter is the right way to look at it. I think being in the community and the network and understanding what's happening behind the scenes is actually much more important, because it's always like the grass is greener kind of situation as well. But I just thought that was interesting and something Lawrence is talking about. And I think people can work on more than one company at once, especially someone like Brett, because he's just a fundraiser essentially. Like he's not actually the one doing the engineering behind the scenes. But if you're very early in your career, you know, you can't really do that unless you are also willing to make the investment in like becoming that fundraiser, kind of that person who can do the sales and the higher level thinking and actually hire excellent people to be the ones that they're the ones who are focused entirely on your one company. You know, like you're not going to have an employee who's working for all 4 of these companies probably, unless they're also like high level, you know? So it's kind of an abstraction thing as well. But at the end of the day, the people who are truly delivering like the code and the engineering at the end of the day really need to be focused, in my opinion. Okay, next we have an announcement from Cloudflare, which is quite interesting. You know, we've covered a lot of the drama between Vercel and Cloudflare, so it would be interesting to get Vercel's take on this, because I know they would probably have some responses to this blog of like pointing things out or calling BS on some things. But Cloudflare is announcing their new dynamic workers, which allows you to execute AI-generated code in secure, lightweight isolates. This approach is 100 times faster than traditional containers. So they're comparing it to like Docker, right? And deploying Docker code, which is kind of its own sandboxed VM situation. But essentially what they have here, though, is kind of like the same worker infrastructure, which is basically being able to run code in isolated JavaScript. But what this does, instead of like deploying the code itself or being like, here's my software that runs every time, you know, this request gets hit, it's going to run this specific thing, like a auth handler or, you know, some report generator or something. This is more for like agentic systems where like you deploy the dynamic worker, but then when you actually call it, you can pass in dynamic code at any time. So you can say like, okay, run this code right now, as opposed to like previously with workers, you would like specify the code that's meant to be run. run. So very interesting. They go into detail on like what the actual approach is and how they make it work, and they kind of like talk about like why using TypeScript is good for these things and why you want to use like a TypeScript interface as kind of the MCP, and it's pretty interesting. So yeah, check it out. Okay, next we have this blog from this guy Dmitry Kovalenko, and he basically is just calling out Cursor on their benchmark. They had this announcement, I think we talked about it before, where they were mentioning how they managed to make indexing of projects extremely fast and how they do like kind of the smart indexing. I think I might be conflating it with something else that they were talking about, which is like how they index projects, and especially large projects for new teammates who hop onto Cursor, where they can kind of reuse some of the indexes. But this specifically is talking about their indexing for the Chromium code base. But basically it's a pretty long article, but long story short, he goes into like kind of the very deep CS stuff, you know, kind of what we talked about with the Vercel Bloom filters. He actually says in this article that like AI really likes to use Bloom filters apparently. So I had never heard of that data structure before that Vercel blog, but it's kind of interesting to see that he's saying like it's actually very common with AI. But he just talks about like the search, and he shows kind of a demo as well of his project, and he works on FFF for NVim, which is NeoVim, which is kind of like a Vim extension that makes it a lot better and a lot easier to use kind of like as an IDE. But he just goes into all these details. He says that like Cursor was kind of like misunderstanding some things. He talks about like these trigrams, which I guess is used for indexing for like sets of 3 characters, I guess, and managing all that. But then he like says deeper in the article that they kind of like backtrack on themselves because they're using like quadgrams or something. So I don't know too deep like the CS of this, but I found this like article interesting, and this is another one of like, if you're interested in CS, this is definitely a blog to check out. Okay, next we have a tweet from Andrej Karpathy, who is ex-OpenAI, ex-Tesla, very well known in the AI industry, talking about how this project LiteLLM, which is a YC project, so they were getting dunked on a lot, but they were compromised in a supply chain attack, which was enough to exfiltrate SSH keys, any credentials, pretty much anything in the process.env or your environment variables. So very scary. And also, I believe it is a dependency of OpenClaw. And he kind of goes into this idea, and he kind of breaks down like how it all happened and the idea of like supply chain attacks. So this is kind of like well-known stuff at this point, but I'll just speak on it because, you know, back when I was learning how to code, this was still something that I think people were misunderstanding. So, you know, when NPM first came out, which is the Node Package Manager, it was all about like, what can you install, you know? So the whole joke is like, there's an is-odd package. So it's like, literally you would check, like if a number is odd, you would install a package to do that. Because the whole point was that you're building on top of these bricks to make software so that you don't have to rewrite everything and it's already written for you. But the issue with that is that you don't own that supply chain, right? So if anyone takes over that package and they just add a curl to an external server with all of your environment variables, you're going to be quote unquote pwned immediately. So people kind of stopped with that, you know, people stopped doing is odd, but still a lot of packages are dependent on, especially for like larger packages, right? So if you use something like Express or one of these like API wrappers for JavaScript, it's using hundreds, if not thousands of packages under the hood. And each one of those packages is using like dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of packages under the hood. So it only takes one of those to go rogue, and then you kind of are getting owned by just using a simple HTTP server. So now a lot of people have caught on to that, but it's still interesting. But like LiteLLM was compromised in this supply chain attack, and it's very quick that people discover these things, you know? So it's also kind of like speaks to not updating super quickly, right? And like making sure that updates are validated, and also doing like nightly updates, I guess, from the researcher perspective, where if these projects release nightly updates, then the researchers have time to understand and look into them before they actually make it to the general populace. But nonetheless, like one of the strategies that people have for avoiding this now is like you just take the package and you just copy the entire code base over, as opposed to relying on the patches, but then you lose some of the security patches as well, so you have to keep it up to date. So it's kind of a trade-off of like, are you going to let people handle these things for you, or are you going to own it yourself? But obviously when you let them handle it for you, you still have the responsibility of making sure everything's safe, and you're going to have the customers on your ass if things go poorly. Okay, next we have a tweet from Linear. If you're not sure who they are, they're a project management software kind of similar to Jira or ClickUp or one of those companies, but they're kind of like the next gen, and people really like them in the software engineering community. I'm still on Jira. I have tried Linear out. I'm not a huge fan of their setup, and I do think it is a bit overly complex as well. And I have kind of experimented with building my own project management as well, which I'm sure a lot of people who are software engineers in the AI boom have also experimented with. But it's pretty cool what they're working on, and they're kind of stepping out. They're going vertical, right? So what they currently do is like the project management, the issue management, so you can like mark things as done, you can plan things out, you can create subtasks and all that. But what they rightly realized, and what we've covered before, is now they're moving into like code review. So you can actually do code review through Linear, especially because GitHub, you know, was having all these performance issues, and these uptime issues, but they have made some work to fixing that. But essentially what they announced today is that they're doing this like next idea of like, here's what comes next for linear, and essentially it's going vertical. So one of the main things they're adding is they're adding the coding agent, which they had before. They're adding their linear agent, which I believe they had before, but I guess now it's becoming generally available. So that's like their AI assistant that you can talk to, and it can manage issues, and it can delegate and be agentic in a way, and kind of handle all of these things where you can talk to it through Slack and be like, create this issue or manage this issue, or where were we at with this thing. And then also what I believe they added too is like this cloud-based skills, which is something I was talking about as well earlier, which I thought just made perfect sense, because why would you have skills in GitHub if you want like real-time updates? You know, you would have to manage all of the version control issues with that. So I believe now linear will own your skills for you, and you can just ingest them and import them as you need. And then the last thing they added too is like agentic automation workflows, which I believe like, you know, Jira and all these guys already have like workflows where it's like very specific conditional logic, but I guess now this would be like more LLM driven logic, so it's more flexible and dynamic, but obviously needs more tweaking and prompting and interpretation and all that. So it's not like they're solving like the massive problems, but it is very interesting to see where they're moving, because I do think linear is very nicely positioned to kind of take over these vertical pieces of like not just project management, but also code delivery, also review, also documentation. Like I know they added their docs like about a year ago, which was a big request, because it's kind of like one of those things, like even pre-AI, you need your knowledge base kind of next to your project management because they're so closely entwined. And then you also realize, oh, your code base is actually very closely entwined to your project management and to your documentation. So very interesting to see where they're going. I think competitors are going to have a hard time keeping up. I know Atlassian just laid off a bunch of people, so I don't know where they're positioning or how they feel about all of this. Definitely, like I know Linear has taken a lot of their market share, but very interesting to see where we move forward. And they're also talking about like what's coming next is like code diffs and code generation, I believe, as well. So just very interesting. Okay, next we have this tweet from Cursor, which is a technical report describing how Composer 2 was trained. They got a lot of flack because they were using Kimi K2.5 under the hood, but they weren't really like upfront about it. But then they kind of did some PR management. I haven't seen people talking too much trash about it. It's one of those things like on Twitter especially, but also in the AI boom on Twitter, is that like these things come and go so quickly. You know, people get so mad. Everyone was so mad at Claude. I know Theo made a video recently where he's still pretty mad at Claude because T3 Code now supports Claude Code like under the hood, but they're doing it in a different way than OpenCode, so that they're maintaining Claude Code's harness so that they shouldn't be bannable. But Claude Code and Anthropic just have not been upfront about what actually is bannable when using their API and when using the subscription, which obviously you would want to use because you get so many more tokens like per dollar compared to using the API straight up. But nonetheless, Cursor comes out with a technical report, which is very cool, like open research, like people are saying, where they talk about how they trained Composer 2 and why it's better than Kimi, especially these benchmarks. So you can see here, they're optimizing for cost to be very low compared to something like Opus 4.6, which is what everyone's using with Claude Code. It's like $2.50 per task compared to like 40 cents per task. And same of median completion tokens per task. You can see here it's still a little bit less than Opus, and Sonnet, I guess, like is a ton of tokens. I know Sonnet's gone down a little bit. There was like an Opus 4.6 outage, and I switched to Sonnet to handle that, but I forgot to switch back. So I was actually like, why is my AI being trash right now? But it turned out to just be on Sonnet. And they're showing like some pre-training results. I don't know too much about this. This is more like deep AI stuff. If you're in the training and the research field, I'm sure this will make sense to you and be kind of interesting. They talk about the reinforcement learning and their benchmark Cursor bench, and then you can see here at the bottom they have like the benchmark which shows like, okay, Kimi is only 36 in the Cursor bench, whereas Composer 2 is 61.3, and compared to Composer 1.5 and 1, they've made drastic improvements, about 50% improvement each time. You can see though in the kind of like open source SWE bench and terminal bench, I think it is a bit closer. I guess on the terminal bench it's quite better, but you can see here for the SWE bench, which I think is like not owned by Cursor, that it is a bit more of an even comparison. So it is interesting to see like what is the specific Cursor bench. Obviously they have their own harness, and one of my colleagues is a really big fan of Cursor now, especially with like the sub agents that are happening, but nonetheless very interesting, and you can read the full report here. Okay, and our last story is from Ngrok, which if you're not familiar with who they are, basically their main product was actually selling like making your local host accessible for the internet, especially for like webhooks and testing those. That's like a very important piece that they solved like out the gate for like 10 years ago. You know, it's like one of those first tools that people learn when it's like, oh, I need to connect Stripe or I need to connect Discord, but I'm trying to test locally. Like, what do you use? You use Ngrok. So kind of interesting like how they've pivoted, I guess, on this blog specifically. I don't know exactly what their project does now. They still say one gateway for all your traffic. So maybe they're pivoting more towards AI, or maybe they're pivoting more towards like a hosting or kind of like an API gateway kind of system. But nonetheless, they have this really interesting blog post that I didn't fully read, but you can just see in the replies here is very interesting, where they talk about quantization, which you can see here is the idea of like taking an LLM and making it 4 times smaller and 2 times faster with barely any quality loss. And there is like some drama with this. People really haven't been talking about it a lot before, but it was kind of the idea of like whenever a model, especially like an Anthropic model, people would talk about a lot, would get worse overnight, not during peak work hours. It was always thought like, oh, they're quantizing it behind the scenes, which is basically they're making it cheaper to run, but it's effectively performing worse. And they say here, like even barely any quality loss is not zero quality loss, right? But then Anthropic and Tariq came out and they said they never quantize their models. They never change their models. So I don't know exactly like where the truth is on that and if quantization has been like a problem for these models underperforming or what other reason would be caused by that. I know Reese said like maybe it was kind of like a mental thing internally where you start to realize the problems in the models as you get more used to them. But you know, so many people talking about it at once doesn't really align with that. But these interactive blogs are the coolest thing. You know, I think like Kent C. Dodds and those kind of people were the first to like really pioneer these, but now with AI, they're just so easy to make and, you know, so much more interactive. And like, especially if you had like a chat on the side where you could ask questions or like use Dio, which is what I use the browser for asking questions, you can just learn a lot so quickly. But they just kind of go in, they break down these like different things. They explain like floating bit numbers and like how you can do like different levels of precision, which also like helps with quantization and helps with spacing and memory and storage. And you can see here, they explain like the different floats of like float 16, float 8, float 4. So pretty interesting. Also like one of these things, like if you're interested in research and computer science, definitely something to check out. And just cool that Ngrok's kind of pivoting on these blogs as well, because definitely not related to their service, but you know, just stuff that their customers I'm sure are very fascinated in, including myself. This kind of stuff interests you and you want to talk with some like-minded people, join the Audinato Discord in the description. Thanks.